Hurricane Katrina. Who will ever forget the magnitude of the hurricane and the impact that it had on the people in the South, and in particular, the folks in the state of Louisiana? You know, I remember vividly the images of the people housed in the Superdome, and more so the folks that were outside of the Superdome because they could not deal with the stench and the spookiness of the structure. Did you know that Hurricane Katrina is the most costly natural disaster in U.S. history? Property damage alone was over $100 billion, 108 to be exact, but over $100 billion, that's a lot of money. And I remember the levee breaches that contributed to the extreme flooding in New Orleans and the surrounding parishes. Did you know that over 80% of the city was underwater? You know, and I recently read that the breaches were the result of using shorter steel pilings in the levees to save money. Federal disaster declarations covered 90,000 square miles. Now, let me put that into context for you. The UK is about 95,000 square miles. And what that means is that the declaration zone was almost the size of the UK. That is incredible. And what's most important, none of this takes into consideration the lives lost and the people displaced. There was over 1,800 people that died, and over 1 million people that were displaced out of their homes, who had to move to other states and other locations. In fact, I live in Northern California. I've told you that in the past, and we had a family from the state of Louisiana in my hometown. And what's remarkable is that it has been almost 10 years. It's actually been more than 10 years since Katrina. And what's crazy is the recovery efforts are still going on today.
One of the things that struck me, and I've seen it in other places, and it's not just Louisiana, but how really resilient the American people are. You know, you're hit by something that is genuinely catastrophic, yet you're still willing to go back and fight and build it back and all. And those places that were hit hard with Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita, you go back to them today and you can see the resilience that has been built back, not only in the physical infrastructure, but in the people. Those people are resilient. They're hard. They come back. They don't give up.
Welcome to Resilient, where we hear stories from leaders on risk, crisis, and disruption. And we get those stories by jumping on a plane and meeting our guests on their home turf. My name's Mike Kearney, the leader of Deloitte's Strategic Risk Practice. And today I'm sitting down with Mark Riley, the Deputy Director for Disaster Recovery for the state of Louisiana. The man who manages an $18 billion budget and is responsible for Katrina recovery efforts, as well as several other natural disasters that have happened over the last several years. And we're meeting in Baton Rouge at the FEMA Joint Field Office. And this is basically the place where people work around the clock to clean up from past natural disasters and are getting ready for the next one. And I have to tell you, I'm really excited to talk to Mark. We do pre-calls in advance of these podcasts, and I learned quickly that Mark is the real deal, a former Marine, a natural leader, a man of unquestioned great character, and you may even hear his dry sense of humor during our conversation. Hey, Mark, welcome to our Resilient podcast, and thank you for joining us. You know, we're sitting in your FEMA Joint Field Office. Love to just give everybody kind of a sense of what is done here.
Well, first of all, let me say the word resilience is interesting in my environment, because when I started in 2007, it wasn't part of the vocabulary, but over the last 3 or 4 years, it's really become part of the vocabulary, and it has a significant meaning. But this office, and I have about 300 state employees here, and FEMA probably has another 200 FEMA employees that are permanently here. But this is the focal point for the FEMA Stafford Act grant programs that come into play after there has been a presidential declaration. And then occasionally, when there is an active presidential declaration, this is also the facility that FEMA uses to stand up their joint field office that's active in the response end of a disaster declaration. So that's what happens here. This is actually a FEMA building, a federal facility, as you saw when we came through the gates.
A very interesting
Right.
place. So you just made a comment about resilience has become much more important over the last several years. And kind of just jumping off the first question I was going to have, but when you think of resilience, what does it mean to you, and how has it become, or why has it become that much more important over the last several years?
When I first started in this business, we were stovepiped, and recovery, which is the name of my division, is the recovery division, and recovery was really a stovepipe process that simply managed grants that came into place because of a disaster. But then as we started to explore and experience, I mean, Louisiana, Kiplinger's newsletters designated Louisiana as the most disaster-prone state in the Union, right? So we've had a number of very significant disasters even since Katrina. And as we go through these disasters, we learn each time. And one of the things that we've discovered is that recovery is a much broader effort than simply managing these little grant programs. It's really about reinstituting the community that's been affected. And the resilience part of that is, if you take a plain reading of the Stafford Act, it says, in the public assistance program, for example, it says, we will build back that building that was damaged like it was before the event. Well, like it was before the event caused it to be damaged by the event. So resilience says, I'm going to build it back better so that the next time there's an event like this, it will survive. But that applies to the whole of the community, not just that physical structure, but the whole of the community. We want that community to come back so it's better able to survive the next event that comes down the pike.
Mark, you were brought in 2007, which was obviously after Katrina, but it was also after a series of other major hurricanes. What was it like when you came in? How bad was it?
Bad is kind of a relative concept, and it kind of depends on how you measure it. Certainly for that individual family that lost their home and all their furniture, all their belongings, it was real bad. For many of the communities that were affected, it was real bad. I'll use St. Bernard Parish as an example. I came in July of 2007. I made a trip down there because that was the most one of the most significantly impacted parishes. It was still a war zone. The parish had lost 60% of its population. Street lights still didn't work. You have entire strip shopping malls that were vacant with broken windows and trash in the parking lots. And they were just, 2 years later, they were just beginning to recover. If you want to measure it, again, in my world, which is the Stafford Act world, which includes the public assistance program and the individual assistance program, Katrina, in dollars, Katrina is the largest disaster in U.S. history. It is the number one of the top 10 disasters. If you take the next 9 disasters and add up the dollar amounts, Katrina is still greater.
Wow.
2 months later, the state got hit by Rita, again, a significant hurricane event. If you put Rita and Katrina together for the state, they are 4 times larger than the next 8 disasters in the United States. And that includes 9/11, and that includes Sandy. You know, people talk a lot about Sandy, and I say the difference between Sandy and Katrina is that New York has a better public relations machine than we do. And they had a superstorm, we just had a hurricane. But there's a significant difference. So bad is kind of relative. It was bad financially, bad for the economy, bad for the individual families, bad for the communities that were impacted.
Where did most of those people, so the St. Bernard's Parish, you said 60% had left the area?
Yeah.
Where did they go?
They literally went all over the country. Most of them, and in fact, if you go to an area that we call the North Shore, that's on the north side of Lake Pontchartrain across from New Orleans, many of them migrated over there because they still had family ties, they had work and everything. One of the stories I like to tell is that in 2009, so this is 5 years after the disaster, I go to San Antonio, Texas, and I check into an Embassy Suites, and the manager there, and as you know, Embassy Suites have the breakfast in the morning. He says, if you want breakfast, you need to come down early. And I said, well, why? He said, because we have and he didn't know I was from Louisiana. He said, we have a couple of families here still from Katrina from Louisiana. And they come down every morning and they scoop up all the breakfast and bring it back to the room, and that's how they live. So literally, Houston, Texas, great pictures of the Astrodome just full of evacuees from Louisiana, and many of them stayed. So parishes like St. Bernard lost 60%. They're probably back up to about 80% of the population they had post-Katrina. New Orleans has come back strong. So many of them left, many of them stayed out of state, many of them returned.
One of the things that I'm finding interesting about having these conversations is what compels leaders like yourself to take a job like this. So it was obviously a couple years after Katrina hit. What was the reason that you took it? Was there a deeper reason that connected you to this crisis that you wanted to get involved?
Well, I want to be very, very frank. The reason that made me take this job was my wife. At the time that Katrina hit, it really wasn't much of a blip on my radar. I was with the Department of Defense assigned to this place called the Joint Warfighting Center and was doing good things. But we just had a set of twins, and she wanted to come back home. So I'd had some background right after 9/11 in the Homeland Security world. The Governor's Office of Homeland Security Emergency Preparedness, the Homeland Security said, well, let me see what I can do down there. So we got in touch. I was fortunate enough to get hired. I thought I was getting hired as the Homeland Security Director. And when I came in, my boss says, well, I think I've got something else I want you to do. And he sent me over to the Joint Field Office to take over the recovery process. So it wasn't as purposeful as it might have should have been, but this is where I am. I mean, when I showed up here, I couldn't spell FEMA. I didn't know what the Stafford Act was. So, now I spell FEMA, 30, 40 times a day, and I sleep with the Stafford Act. So that was the transition to this world.
Well, it's amazing. I could probably share a lot of stories of what my wife has made me do over the years, too.
Exactly.
So Mark, one of the things that I think is fascinating about Katrina, not only back in 2005, but even just in the ensuing years, are some of the real life stories. And you've already shared some just in the first few minutes, but is there a story that you go to that really brings to life the impact that Katrina and the ensuing hurricanes had on the people within Louisiana?
Unfortunately, in the world that I'm in, I don't get to interact as much as I'd like with the individuals that are affected. But I'm going to go back to St. Bernard Parish. So the topic of this forum is leadership. So they had a superintendent of schools who was an English teacher. Mm-hmm. And that's all she'd been all her life, was an English teacher. The disaster hit, and she was such a leader that she recognized immediately that, and it literally destroyed all the schools in St. Bernard Parish. She realized that people aren't going to come back to the parish unless we have schools that are operating. So she came and she conned FEMA into putting trailers immediately down in St. Bernard Parish so the teachers could come back. And then they jury-rigged buildings to be schools. And then with the teachers and the schools, she announced the schools are open, people started coming back. So every year they host an anniversary event, and it's usually a breakfast, and it's at the high school that's been completely rebuilt, and they hold an anniversary event, and it's full of leaders from all over the state, significant individuals from the parish, and it's a presentation by the kids who at the 10th anniversary, which was last August, the kids that were given the program were in the 4th grade at the time. And so they were recounting their experiences in the program. And we've had people like Betty Ford come, senators. We had the First Lady come one time. It's a significant event. Yeah. Significant event. But listening to those kids talk about the impact that the event had on their life and their feeling about the recovery process and where they are today is just an amazing experience.
Well, but she was not she was just an English teacher.
No, she was the superintendent of schools at the time, but her background was as an English teacher. Okay. And she was like me, and she'd admit this to you, that she didn't know how to spell Stafford Act when this came about, but she is probably a premier expert right now because she figured it out and she's implemented it and she's brought that school system back.
Mark, before we get into, I really want to talk about, you came in and what some of your priorities are, but one of the things I'm finding is that the leaders that are at the center of these crises, in many respects are special. And a lot of times it goes back to kind of their upbringing, the things that they did. So I'd love to just kind of spend a few minutes just talking about you and kind of where you grew up and, some things that maybe shaped you as a leader. I'd love to talk about your time in the Marines, but maybe let's just start just where you grew up.
Well, my dad was in the Navy, so in my younger days, we lived around. By the time I was probably 12, I'd been around the world at least once. Within the states, I mean, I was born in Virginia. I did spend some time here in Baton Rouge and made a couple of good friends, and that's how I ended up back here in my college days. I actually graduated from high school in Hobbs, New Mexico. So, and lived some time in Texas during middle school and high school. So, I've gotten all kind of flavors, from my family's from, my parents are from the Boston and New Hampshire area. So I have that flavor living in the deep South and then in the West. So I've kind of been all over.
Anything that you could point to when you were younger that really started to shape you, who you are today, the values that you have, which we'll be getting into later?
Well, obviously, my father had a big impact on my values. And one of the things he did when I was a young teenager is he decided that I wasn't going to sit around all summer long. I was going to go do something productive. And he had friends, all over the country. So he would buy me an airplane ticket and send me to one of his friends to work. And as he put me on the plane, he'd say, okay, if you want to come back, you have to earn the money to buy the ticket to come back. So I would go off during the summer. I mean, one summer I went to a pig farm. One summer I went to a cotton mill in North Carolina. I think the pig farm was in Texas. I worked on a survey crew here in Louisiana one summer. And my sole responsibility was to be able to get back home. So that gave me a sense of independence and, take care of myself and that sort of thing.
It's funny because I could almost pull up my phone and show you the text that I have to my son last night. I was flying across the country. He's 16 years old, and our biggest argument is, what are you going to do this summer? So maybe I should find a place, send him on a plane, and have him pay for his ticket to come home.
Well, you learn, I mean, as a young man, you learn some lifelong lessons. For example, when you work on a pig farm, a girl won't go out with you more than twice if you smell like a pig. So you learn those sorts of things, and it's a good lesson for a young man.
So you became a Marine. You didn't go into the Navy. So what compelled you to enlist in the Marines?
Well, my dad was actually a Naval Academy graduate, and my older brother was an Air Force Academy graduate.
Okay.
And they were both pressuring me to go to an academy. LSU was known as a party school, and that attracted me more than the academy. But I always, because of the environment I grew up in, I always knew that I would eventually end up in the services somewhere. So when I was in law school, I went to an event and ran across a Marine Corps recruiter, and he signed me up on the spot, and there you go.
Any lessons that you've pulled in from your time as a Marine to what you do today? How did that shape you, who you are today?
Well, you asked me earlier about people who had influenced. The Marine Corps has a pretty strong tradition of leadership, and I ran across a number of people that I consider even to this day as great leaders, and my experience with them taught me a lot. I'll give you a short example. So I was a judge advocate in the Marine Corps, a lawyer in the Marine Corps, right? And I did that for a number of years, and then decided that I wanted to do something more exciting than that. And so I went to the general of my command, and I said, I want to do something different. And so this was a Marine Corps brigade, and within the brigade you have a headquarters and service company, and he was losing his company commander. And so I asked if I could do it, and he said, yeah, I'll allow you to go ahead and do it. And he appointed me as the company commander, and he said, I want to give you one piece of advice. He said, you go into that company, you find that staff sergeant or gunnery sergeant, which is mid-level management in an organization like that, you figure out which one of those staff sergeants and gunnery sergeants are running the operation, and you become friends with them and figure out how to do it, because I can tell you don't know how to do it, and you find people around you that know how to do it, and then you'll succeed. And so I did that, and we did succeed very well.
And you've taken that lesson in other parts of
exactly.
your life.
You apply lessons like that wherever you go.
It's funny. One of the things that is beginning to pop up as a kind of a common theme is, and it sounds like this is what you're saying, is the importance of mentors. And oftentimes people think, those that have ascended to great places don't need mentors, which I think is absolutely probably incorrect, because it's a common theme we're beginning to hear from each of these leaders that we're speaking to.
No, I mean, I would have never made. For example, if I'd have walked into that headquarters and service company and taken charge as if I knew anything, I'd have been a complete failure.
Right.
And there are other things you can, in life, you not only have mentors, but you have examples of things not to do.
Right.
And so you pick up on those things also.
So let's pivot to when you came in 2007. Can you? And it sounded like you had a lot to learn. You learned how to spell FEMA and the Stafford Act and things of that nature. But in all sincerity, when you started to really think about what was most important in, say your first 100 days, 180 days, whatever it may be, what were some of your initial priorities, Mark?
Well, the first 100 days, I concentrated on learning the regulatory and statutory environment with which I was working, because I fuss at FEMA all the time. A disaster happens, and what do? You bring this huge bureaucracy, not only in the staff that you bring, but in the programs that you bring. And you have to understand that bureaucracy to be successful. So spent a lot of time doing that, but I identified the key players in the environment. And in a disaster, both response and recovery, and that's an important distinction because they're really two different activities.
Right.
There are three primary players: the federal government, and in my case, which is FEMA; the state government, which was myself, and the locals are the applicants. We call them applicants in the program. And when I came in, it became very apparent that the relationship between those three primary players was very dysfunctional. So I went about trying to figure out things that we could do to put some functionality in how we were operating, and really try to build a partnership between those three entities so that we could all have a unified goal and work forward to it. An earlier question, just to put all this in context, an earlier question that you asked was, how bad was it?
Yep.
Currently, Louisiana has 11 open disasters. We're managing close to $17 billion with over 35,000 projects, about 35,500 projects.
Hey, Mark, can you define, just because everybody may not, what is a project?
Okay, so, and this is in the public assistance and hazard mitigation grant program
Yep.
world. So if this building was damaged by an event, we'd bring FEMA in here and we'd look at the damage, we'd identify what damage in the building was caused by a hurricane, and then we'd put an estimated amount to repair that, and we put that in a project worksheet. It's a formal document that FEMA then obligates dollars to complete that project, to repair this building. And so that's a project.
Can you go back to because you brought up something, I think that there's broader applicability than just within your world, and that's about relationships. You said one of the key things that you came in and really had to do was create a deep relationship between those three entities.
Right.
Do you have any perspectives on, or maybe even any lessons, or just thinking back around the importance of that beyond maybe what you've shared around the importance of relationships? Because it sounds so common. Of course you need to develop relationships, but that was the first thing that you mentioned.
We had talked off of this broadcast about a thing I call the Riley Rules. And it's a one-page document that I created, I don't know, probably 20 years ago. And I've modified it over time. But two of the concepts in it are trust is indispensable, and a requirement in any sort of activity like this is communicate, collaborate, cooperate. Mm-hmm. And so without that partnership in which, hey, I trust you, and we understand because we all communicate differently. So when I'm in an event like this, the first thing I do is go in and establish and try to understand what your method of communication is, so that there's clear understanding between us. And that builds that partnership. So that when you say something and I can understand it and I respond to it, then we've got that trust. And it doesn't require, and this happens all the time with FEMA, it doesn't require that we agree on everything. But if we disagree, it's within that environment, and there's clear understanding between us and respect between us about the disagreement.
One of the things in doing my homework that I've heard about you is that you're a pretty innovative guy, or try to find innovative solutions to some of the challenges that you have. And one of the examples that I loved, and maybe if you could explain this, is that there are things called meal replacements, and there's a certain cost associated with that. And I know that I heard a story where you actually engaged local restaurants and food trucks to supplement meal replacements at a fraction of the cost. Hopefully I got that story right. Can you share that with us?
So this was actually during Hurricane Gustav. So when an event like a big hurricane happens, the governor stands up the Unified Command Group, which is really all of his cabinet secretaries, and then we were meeting, and during Gustav, sometimes twice a day, to talk about things that were going on and things that were needing. FEMA comes in, and at that point in time, they were the pipeline for water and meals ready to eat, MREs, right? That's actually a military grade quantity. When I'm out in the field, that's what I eat, right?
Yep.
But in Gustav, we evacuated 2 million people from South Louisiana. Many of the homes in South Louisiana were without electricity for up to 60 days. So you can't cook, you can't do all that stuff. So there are people that need food. So we would rely on FEMA to provide us with these MREs, and we distribute these MREs to people that need it. Well, the FEMA pipeline dries up, and it was a surprise to everybody.
Meaning they have no more MREs.
Right. I mean, the logistics train coming into the state was disrupted, and it was going to be disrupted for 3 or 4 days. And so I'm sitting around with the commissioner of the Division of Administration, which is a senior state agency, and we're talking about what our options are. And she says, well, I know the director of the Louisiana Restaurant Association. Let's call him and find out if they can help. And so we did. And sure enough, he said, oh yeah, we've got many restaurants that have mobile feeding facilities, and we'll be glad to mobilize these people and get them out in the field to feed them. So for 3 days or 3 to 4 days, we distributed over 500,000 hot meals. MREs are not hot meals. They come in a bag. Hot meals. So when it was all done and things started getting quiet, I asked the question, I wonder how much this is going to cost us. So we did some accounting. Now an MRE from FEMA cost us $9.40. These hot meals that we were getting were costing us $5.60. So we saved almost $4 a meal. Not only that, in an emergency like this, the economics of the communities are disrupted. For example, people don't go to restaurants. Restaurants lose money. But here was an opportunity to get that same money that we would otherwise give into the federal government back into our local economies.
So it sounds like, Mark, that innovation is pretty core to kind of how you've led this group over the last 10 years. I think this is a great example, not only of just identifying that one opportunity, but really scaling it and creating something programmatic so that it goes well beyond restaurants, as you indicated. Any additional thoughts on innovation? Any other examples on the importance of innovation in this type of environment?
Well, I think innovation is important in any environment. I'm going to go back to Riley rules again. One of my Riley's rules is the thing I call destructive innovation. I have distributed a copy of all of the Riley rules to all my staff, and I talk to them all the time about destructive innovation. And I say, if you see something that you think can be done better, and you don't raise that issue, to your management, then you failed.
Shame on you. Yeah.
Yes. The other thing I like about destructive innovation, if somebody brings an idea to me, I test it harshly. And if that individual can stand up to that idea he's got, then it's my concept that it's a good idea because he believes in it and he can stand up to it. If they fall quickly because of the questions I ask them, I said, go back and rethink what you're saying. So that concept is important, and so I try to apply that in everything we do. And our systems here are really, and it's hard to explain in this environment the process that takes place with those 300 people out there. But it is a process. We have created a system, but that system is always changing because what we've created the first day, we experience, and then we're able to rethink it and look at it, and also understand that this isn't a widget making business where all the widgets look alike. So you have to have a flexible process that adjusts to the type of widget that's coming through. And so we make those adjustments all the time.
Hey, Mark, I'm going to put you on the spot. There's Riley rules, which I have in front of me. They're fantastic. Are you okay if we post them with this podcast?
Sure, yeah.
I love them. I wanted to ask you a question, though, on the destructive innovation. What it says before that is welcome dissent. And then after that, it says destructive innovation. But when a decision is made to execute as a team, regardless of whose idea is it. Can you expand on the dissent? Because I think that's really important.
Well, I hate to walk into a room and say, okay, of my managers and say, okay, here's my idea, let's go execute it. I want them, as I would test it if they came in, I want them to test me. And I emphasize a lot in the way I speak about a team effort. And a team effort is not a hierarchical structure of management where what the director says is absolute and golden. It is a team environment where everyone within that team, within that environment, has an equal footing to stand up and say what they're thinking. Now, at the end of the day, a decision has to be made, and that decision is usually the senior organizational piece in that structure. And once that decision is made, I expect all of the team to get aboard with it, whether they have agreed with it individually or not, right? So there's an opportunity to speak your mind, and hopefully everybody in the room is open-minded enough to listen. But at the end of the day, a decision has to be made, and then we're going to go forward with that as a team.
So, Mark, you're brought in 2007, have been managing this for 9 years. Is there anything in retrospect you'd said, gosh, I would do that a little differently?
Good question. I actually try hard not to look back too much. Again, I learn from mistakes, but I don't try to dwell too much on what's happened in the past. And those things that are big mistakes, I'm not sure I'm willing to disclose them in front of this microphone.
I'd love to get your thoughts on why, and this is it's a question that we're really interested from a firm perspective, because a lot of times clients ask us is, why do certain leaders thrive in a crisis where some fail? Do you have a perspective on that?
I think temperament is a big thing. And I didn't come up with this. This was, we talked earlier about mentors. There's a difference between leadership by example and leadership by direction, right? I can tell you to do something, but is that leadership? I don't think so. There's a difference between leading from the front and leading from behind. And I learned that very, very quickly in my, especially in the Marine Corps. I remember one instance we were doing an exercise when I was the company commander of H&S Company, and we had to set up all these tents. Because the H&S company supports the command structure for a brigade, which are all these senior officers that come in and all, right? So I go out there and I say, okay, we're going to set the tents up here, and then the Marines get out there and they're setting up tents, and I can see that, we need more capacity. So I got out there and started driving stake pegs myself, and then all of a sudden, all these people came out there.
Leadership by example.
Right, and started, and we put this thing up in record time. But, I could have sat there and directed all these people, but they don't go with the same level of enthusiasm as they do if you go out there yourself and participate with this. I personally have always been known as someone that doesn't mind getting their hands dirty. And I do that even here in this office where there's really no mud around, but,
What I think is fascinating is I think there's a misnomer about the military, those that have not been in the military, is that it's not just about command and control. And I've actually heard this from several folks, that you actually have to develop that trust, with the group that you're commanding, and you can't just tell them what to do.
Well, again, back to my story about my first command, General Waters' advice to me, and it's a kind of a concept: find the organizational center. And you're not it, by the way.
Yep.
Right? Find the organizational center, find out what makes it tick, and help it go. Another general I worked with one time, I asked him, I said, well, how did you become general? And he said, because I'm a generalist. He says, I know a little bit about everything, but I know I don't know everything. So I surround myself with experts that know, and I listen to them as I'm making my decisions. And I thought that was a great piece of advice, too.
I love that generalist. I've never heard.
Yeah, well, he was a very clever guy. But you've seen leaders that come in, and I know everything, and so just listen to what I have to say and do it, And to me, that misses the organizational imperatives that are already there in place. The idea of a team is going to be more successful than an individual is. And it misses that if you just come in and dictate.
Mark, one of the questions I'm curious of is you said temperament in crisis leaders. That would almost begin to insinuate that even if you're at a leadership level, certain folks that have that standing within an organization may not be really equipped to lead. Do you agree with that statement? Lead through a crisis.
Right. I mean, certainly there are different leadership styles that will be successful in different venues.
Right.
In a crisis, the worst thing to do is to come in with an uncontrollable temperament. I do my best to stay calm, to not to raise my voice, and you'll notice if you do that, it will kind of spread over the entire environment, and everybody's that way. And then if I see somebody that is kind of too active in the crisis, I'll pull them aside and tell them to go sit down and drink a Coke or something.
Let's move to team. What do you think makes a good or great crisis recovery team?
I think in your question, the word team is very important. It's got to be an emphasis on the team environment and not necessarily organizational seniority, right? Especially in a crisis. I mean, if you've seen people operate in the real response type stuff, search and rescue and all, you see people taking different roles like logistics or, lead scout or something, but it's all a team effort.
Right.
And there's nobody really pointing at, and you go do this and you go do that. And again, a team is good because it practices before the event. And that's very important, not only in response, but in recovery too. And that's a theme that I picked up in another light bulb moment. Even in recovery, if you're not organized and practiced in terms of how you bring that community back together, it's going to take you a lot longer to get it done. So organize and practice that. Understand the capability of the team and the capacity of the team, but also clearly understand the capability and capacity of the individuals in the team. Don't assign a mission to someone who's not equipped to execute that mission.
Yeah, understand what they're good at and deploy them appropriately.
And put them where they're good and make sure that you don't set them up for failure somewhere.
People either love this question or they hate it. Do you have any thoughts on kind of how you want to be remembered, the work that you've done in Louisiana, your legacy?
You're right. I don't like the question. I don't care whether I'm remembered or not. I hope that years from now, when they look back at the things Louisiana's gone through, the historical conclusion is that Louisiana did a good job, and that would make me feel good.
Can you paint maybe a picture of what life is like now in Louisiana?
I don't know that it's a lot different than it was before. One of the things that struck me, and I've seen it in other places, and it's not just Louisiana, but how really resilient the American people are. You're hit by something that is genuinely catastrophic, yet you're still willing to go back and fight and build it back and all. And those places that were hit hard with Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita, you go back to them today and you can see the resilience that has been built back, not only in the physical infrastructure, but in the people. Those people are resilient. They're hard. They come back. They don't give up.
You know what I like about that? Because one of the last questions I wanted to ask is, what are the most important attributes of a resilient leader? But actually, it doesn't even matter if it's a leader. What's the most important attributes of a resilient person? Any thoughts on that, Mark?
I think we've already talked about a lot of this, but trust. I'll keep saying trust. You need to get into an environment and not only, create an environment where people will trust you, right? Understanding the individual uniqueness of those that you're dealing with is going to make you more successful. If you come in with this stereotyped, this is how people ought to react, you're not going to get that trust. First of all, you're not going to get that trust. You're not going to get the communication that's necessary. And then don't take your role as a leader for granted. I'm in charge, so I must know what's going on. It's a heavy burden, and it's not only a heavy burden for you. I mean, you have the heavy burden is the responsibility you have to others in order to make this work. And don't get carried away with yourself. And we talked about it. Don't be afraid to make a mistake. Learn from the mistakes that you've made. In my experience, if you come in and you make that known to the people that are around you that you're trying to make as part of this team, they relax. They start making better decisions. And you end up with good results.
It's funny, Mark, because usually I summarize a lot of what we talked about. You just did a great job. I am going to summarize a couple additional things, but I really appreciate you being on the podcast. I know you're extremely busy. There's a lot going on, and I appreciate the gift of time. There was a few things that I just want to call out, maybe repeating some of the things, but I think it's extremely important. I think one of the things that you said right up front was the importance of relationships. And I think sometimes when we get into crisis situations or managing day to day, we forget about that. And quite frankly, most interactions are a people business, or most businesses are about people, whether it's in the governmental sector, the private sector, whatever it may be. And my experience is if you could create relationships built on trust, you're going to be more successful irrespective of what it is. The other thing that you really hit on, which I think is interesting, is innovation could come in many different forms. And I love kind of where you talked about, well, we had the big idea with the meal replacements, but then there are also a lot of other things that you do within the organization. And I think one of the things that I'm taking away as a great leader is encouraging your people to innovate, encouraging your people to have the case that they need to make when they come to you. And then you as a leader, letting them take the risk of going off and doing it. And if they fail, that's okay. Because like we talked about, oftentimes the best innovations are where you identify some failures, you improve it, you fail, you improve, and you keep iterating it. And then I think a couple other last things is collaboration, I think is another important theme. And, in my prior history, some of the work I did was heavy on bringing groups together. So I really appreciated your example of bringing the state, FEMA, and the applicants together, really to collaborate to create a better solution. And I think that's one of the things, gosh, we could certainly use that in politics a little now. But I think the more people collaborate, the better solutions that they come up with. And I think that ties back to innovation is, better ideas are developed when you collaborate and come together. It's there was a saying from a company that I work from is basically an idea that is developed by a group is always better than the idea of a lone genius. I'm getting it wrong, but I think it's true. And then I love the fact that, and this is a theme that we're hearing through many of our podcasts as well, is that it's not about kind of leading from your perch in your office and telling people what to do, but great leaders really kind of show up and work hand in hand, get their hands dirty with the folks that they're working for. So any last comments, Mark? Hopefully I did a good summarizing what you were talking about.
No, you did. And I think, there's a great quote from Teddy Roosevelt, and I wish I could remember the whole thing, but it starts off by saying it's not the critic that counts. It's the guy that's in the, and I'm paraphrasing, it's the guy that's in the arena with dust and blood. And that's, the leader will get into the arena, put the dust and blood on them, and show people how to get something done.
Well, and the important thing there is if you're in the game, you're always going to have critics.
Right, exactly.
Hey, thank you very much for listening to Resilient, a Deloitte podcast produced by our friends at Rivet Radio. You can hear us by going to Deloitte.com or visiting your favorite podcatcher, keyword resilient. Also, hit me up on LinkedIn with any comments or recommendations you have for future guests. My profile is under Michael Kearney, and it's not spelled like it is in San Francisco. It's Kearney, Kearney. And remember, leaders who embrace risk, improve performance, and are more prepared to lead confidently in the volatile world we live in.